A really popular trend on YouTube these days for musicians and audio engineers alike seems to be these budget-oriented videos showcasing how to record music with more affordable gear. I wanted to take this to the next level and record an entire song, mixed and mastered, with just the microphone on a set of $5 earbuds. I got my buddy Kyle Germain to help me out with this project. He's an extremely talented musician and artist. We used his song Who Do You Wanna Be off of his album Dear Friend. All applicable links for that will be down in the description below. So here's what we were able to come up with. Stay tuned after for a complete breakdown of the recording and mixing process. All right, so as you can probably hear, that sounds pretty good for a $5 earbud microphone. And before I get into the breakdown of the recording and mixing process, I just want to talk a little bit about something, a concept called non-EQ EQ. In the traditional sense, most people might associate EQ or equalization as altering the frequency response of some recorded audio using either an analog audio processing equalizer or a digital plugin in any way, and those work via phase shift to cancel out and boost certain frequencies. But even aspects such as the room, microphone placement, instrument selection, even the composition of the music can have such a massive impact on the spectral content of the audio that you record. So as you can probably tell, I decided to record, mix, and master the entire song in GarageBand. I figured it was fitting, given the whole budget sort of scenario that we had of recording with the microphone on the earbud. So just detailing the recording setup a little bit, essentially it was as simple as having the earbuds plugged into the 3.5 millimeter headphone jack on my MacBook Pro using whatever tiny little microphone preamp they have built into the laptop. So in terms of actually monitoring while recording these tracks, we actually ended up using a separate audio interface and our own headphones just to speed up the process a little bit. Now, it's perfectly feasible to use the actual earbuds themselves that the microphone is on to monitor on. That's not out of possibility, but in our case, we just decided to do that to speed things up a little bit. So in our case, this is a song that Kyle has already recorded, mixed and mastered elsewhere, and put out. So we were able to use that track as our backing track. And so ordinarily, you might want to start recording with drums or bass, more rhythm-oriented instruments. But because we have this reference track in place, we actually ended up starting out with guitar. But in any case, let's start off with talking about the drums. Recording drums with an earbud microphone is definitely very tricky. Drums are a very loud instrument, as you probably know. It's high SPLs involved. And a small little electric condenser that you'll find inside of an earbud microphone is not going to handle that too well. Nor is the preamp built into, your phone or your laptop. So in our case, I experimented with placements over the kick drum, like directly over the kick drum, more oriented towards the snare, and then like closer overhead positions. But ultimately, every time a sharp transient would happen on the kit, whether that be from the kick drum or the snare drum mainly, it seemed to occur mostly with low end. The microphone would cut out for a split second. There must be some sort of cutoff or limiter built in to the laptop that's causing that to happen. So the setup we ended up going with was the microphone just kind of hung on top of a mic stand, positioned kind of like an overhead mic, maybe a little bit further away, basically in line with the drum throne and with the drummer sort of over the floor tom, kind of looking, so to speak, at the kit. Now, of course, it's an omnidirectional microphone, so it's gonna pick up the room and everything around the kit. But thankfully, our room wasn't too bad. The entire room was carpeted. Some of the surfaces were irregular. There was other stuff in there. There was a drop ceiling. So it wasn't too bad. So the first thing you'll notice in GarageBand here is that I've actually duplicated the audio on another track. And one of these has a high-pass filter and one has a low-pass filter. And this is a trick I like to use because it allows me to really separate and control low-end transients and then everything else kind of separately. And of course, you can use something like a multi-band compressor to sort of accomplish the same thing. But in my case, I find it easier to work with the audio if it's split up across two different tracks. So let's listen a little bit to the drums as they came from the microphone. No processing, no high pass, no low pass, nothing. Just the straight audio directly from the microphone. So as you can hear, it's definitely not that bad. It does sound a little bit roomy and kind of distant, because of, well, the room and the mic placement. But overall, everything is defined enough, and there's no weird distortion coming from the preamp or the microphone or anything like that. So it's a clean recording. So let's go through the processing that I've done on these here. The first thing that I ended up doing with the drums was I threw a compressor, stock GarageBand compressor on them. The other thing I would like to mention is that I've only used free or stock plugins on this project, again, to go along with the whole budget theme. So pretty simple compression, just 2-to-1 ratio, 15 millisecond attack, nothing crazy. And here's what that sounds like. So you can hear it evens it out a little bit. It's nothing crazy, but that's what I ended up starting out with. The next thing I ended up doing was adding a multiband compressor. This is the stock Apple AU one that comes with all Mac computers. And I use this specifically to control the mid-range of the recording from around 200 hertz to about 800, roughly. And that sounds like this. So you can hear that's definitely cutting down on those mid-range frequencies a little bit. It seems to be actually reducing the overall level a little bit. Even though it's not compressing a ton in that region, it seems to drop the level of that area quite a bit anyways. I guess that's just how this plugin works. So the next thing I added was just a really simple EQ. Nothing crazy going on here, just some really light shaping, and then the high-pass filter at 132. So then I added another parametric EQ, and here you can see I've done quite a broad boost in the low mids region, centered around 200 hertz. And then I've also done a notch filter at just above 500 hertz. There was a specific frequency coming from the snare drum that I was able to mitigate there. So let's take a listen. So as you can probably hear there's a bit of a resonance in the snare drum around woo, which is roughly a C sharp, which makes sense. It's about a little bit above 500 hertz there, so I decided to cut a little bit of that out. Moving on, I added another compressor. In this case, this is Apple's Dynamics processor for some compression after equalization. And that sounds like this. So as you can hear, that really brings out a lot of punch and snap of the drums. It levels things out even more, but it really makes the transients feel a lot snappier. In this case, I have an attack time of 37 milliseconds and a release time of 68 milliseconds. The ratio is hit pretty hard. I don't think this specific plugin tells you exactly what the ratio is, but it obviously has quite a large knee on it. So it's relatively smooth in that regard. I do actually quite like this plugin, it seems, for just overall drum compression. It does pretty well. And then finally, at the end of the signal chain, I have one more parametric EQ. And you'll notice I'm actually taking out some of those low mids that I added earlier. And that's because I found that adding those low mids earlier actually made the Apple Dynamics processor react in a pretty interesting way. And I wanted to preserve that, but get rid of the low mids, so I ended up just taking them out later. And that's what you see here. So let's take a listen. So as you can see, that really demuddies everything. And I have a sneaking suspicion that the reason why that compressor likes those low mids so much is because a lot of those frequencies in that area are coming from the snare drum. And so boosting those frequencies before the compressor allows it to sort of clamp down on every snare hit and make it really snap through the mix. So processing on the low-pass drum track was pretty straightforward. I started out with Apple's Dynamics processor, just full range, with an attack time of 29 milliseconds and a release time of 62, roughly the same as the other one, and then also a similar threshold and ratio. So let's hear what this sounds like. And of course, like I said before, this is full range, so this is across the entire spectrum. So nothing too special there. Just seemed to make the low end more in control, I guess. I could have technically put this after the low pass, but this is just the way I ended up doing it. The next thing I added was the EQ, and here, as you can see, I've boosted the crap out of the low end just to really bring it to the forefront and give me more headroom when it comes to mixing. And then I've also added a very tight notch filter around 100 hertz. This is about the fundamental of the floor tom, and in my case, the microphone picked up the low end from the floor tom a lot better than it picked up the low end of the kick drum, so that's why I've notched that frequency out there. So putting that in place sounds like this. So here you can hear that the kick drum and the low end from the tom is pretty under control, but if I take out that narrow EQ band, you'll notice that the tom just becomes way louder. And the kick drum loses all definition. So that's why that cut is in place. So finally, I've added GarageBand's developer plugin. It's basically a transient shaper, and I've used this to really make the low end of the drum kit tight and not sloppy by just reducing the release a ton. So let's hear what that does. So you can hear it messes with the tom a little bit. So as you can hear, that really tightened up the low end of the kick drum. And you might have also heard it kind of negatively affected the low end of the floor tom, but I'd much rather have a really punchy kick throughout the song than a slightly weird sounding floor tom. So let's give a listen to both of the drum tracks playing together. So as you can hear, the low end from the kick drum is completely under control. Let's take the enveloper out and just see what it sounds like without. So as you can hear, that enveloper really helps to clean that low end up. All right, so our setup for bass guitar was pretty straightforward. We had a 4x10 bass cabinet by Ampeg, I believe. I don't remember which head we used, and then just my cheap knockoff Fender P-Bass. The earbud microphone was just draped right in front of the cabinet, in front of one of the speakers, just right up against the grill. In terms of processing on the bass guitar, nothing too crazy is happening here. The first thing I added was a stock GarageBand compressor. So let's hear what that does. You can hear the original tone is quite good, actually. So that's just helping out a little bit to even out some slight variations in volume between different notes that were played. Just a 3-to-1 ratio, 5 millisecond attack, really fast on that attack. And that's basically it. So up next, I added a parametric EQ. Here you can see I just have a high pass at around 30 hertz just to remove any low rumbling transients or anything like that were picked up on the recording. Quite heavy boost in the real low end area just because that mic doesn't pick up those frequencies at the same amplitude as some of the higher ones. There was a bit of a problem frequency around 100 hertz, so I've notched that out. And then again, just notching out some more areas higher up around 400 hertz. And then finally, a low-pass filter at around 4,000 hertz to help remove any sympathetic noise coming directly from the bass guitar, as he was using a pick to record, and any noise from the noise floor of the recording. So let's hear what this sounds like. So you can hear that really bumps up the fundamental frequencies of the bass guitar. It also seems to give the bass a little bit more of a tubby sound signature, if you will. So the next thing I've added is another parametric EQ. Pretty simple, just got a very tight notch filter. There seems to be a problem frequency around 60 hertz or so that was significantly louder than the rest, and you might have actually picked up on that. So let's hear what this does. So you can hear that really cuts down on that one note that seemed to be louder than the rest. And then finally in the signal chain, I've added a plugin called TDR Nova. This is a free dynamic EQ plugin. There was a frequency around 200 hertz that needed a little bit of controlling, so I've notched that area out. And this is what this sounds like. All right, so you can hear that removes a little bit of that tubbiness that I was talking about earlier. I decided later it was a little bit too much and it needed to be controlled a little bit because in the mix it was kind of punching through. So that's why that's in place. And that's it for the bass guitar. All right, so now let's talk about recording for the electric guitar. We had a small little Mesa Boogie combo amp, I believe, with a 10 or 12-inch speaker in it. I don't remember the model number. I don't really remember the details on that. And then just a Gibson Les Paul. In terms of mic placement, we simply draped the microphone across the front of the cabinet, just like we did for the bass guitar. So you probably noticed that we actually quad-tracked the guitars for this, and in doing so, we were able to play around with some different mic placements for each of the sets of tracks. So for the first one, we did a pretty simple, directly in the center of the speaker, center of the dust cap. And then for the second set of tracks, we put the microphone at the very edge of the grill to try and get as dark and low mid-rangey a tone as we possibly could. So let's start off with the first set of rhythm guitar tracks. Now you'll notice that I actually have the original mono recordings of each panned left and right at the top here, and then I have a separate track down here for them. And so what I've actually done here is I've panned them left and right, and then bounced them out and brought them back in. Because unfortunately, GarageBand doesn't really have any way to bus tracks together or create any buses besides the master bus. So I wasn't able to process both tracks at the same time. So this was a little workaround. Just bounce it out as a stereo track, bring it in as a stereo track, and then you can process it all at once. So starting out with no plugins, this is what the center of the speaker recordings sounded like. So you can hear we started out with actually a pretty dark tone already. So first thing I've done is I've added a parametric EQ with just a basic low pass at around 100 hertz, and then a little bit of a boost at around 5 kilohertz. This cut ended up being not really used or effective at all, and you'll see why in a minute. But this is what this plugin sounds like. So as you can see, again, just a high pass, and then it just kind of brightens the guitar up a little bit around that 5K area. So up next, I added Apple's Reverb plugin. This isn't really doing a whole lot. It's just adding a little bit of extra ambience that you might be able to hear. So here's what this sounds like. You can hear the decay a little bit when I stop playing there. It's a really short decay, just slight bit of ambience. You also notice it kind of dropped the overall level a bit. That just has to do with the way this plugin works and having a single slider for the dry and wet mix. You can't have 100% dry signal and some wet signal. So that's kind of how that works. It's kind of an auto balancing thing. Up next, I added another parametric EQ. And here you'll see I've just boosted a schnizzle load of top end to just really get the brightness out of this recording because it was just too dark for me. So let's hear what this sounds like. So yeah, massive difference there. Thankfully, all of those frequencies were actually there in the recording. They just weren't recorded very loud, let's say. But thankfully, they were all present, and I was able to just boost it up a bunch and really give the guitar some bite. So now let's take a look at the second layer of rhythm guitars. Like I said, it was a much further placement from the speaker, so it was even darker of a tone. So let's compare between the dry, unprocessed tone of this track versus the other set of tracks. So as you can hear, there's a lot less high frequency here. Yeah, there's a bit of a level deficiency between the two. But still, even despite that, you could probably hear how they differ. Processing on this track was dead simple. Just a single parametric EQ with a high pass, a bunch of mid-range cutout, and then a slight bit around 1.5K. So here's what this sounds like. So again, it's really just demuddying things a bit further, really taking a ton of those mids out. So for every other guitar track, we decided to use the same setup as the first set of rhythm guitar tracks with the microphone directly in the center of the speaker. So we actually have an additional rhythm guitar layer for each chorus. This is the same part, but tracked again, and then that sits directly in the middle, completely mono. So for the choruses, we actually have 5 tracks of rhythm guitars going at once, which is pretty cool, honestly. So for this one, again, processing is pretty simple, so let's check it out. So processing on this track was dead simple. Just a high-pass filter around 100 hertz or so, a little bit of low mid-cut, a little bit of mid-boost, and then the similar sort of high-end boost that we saw on the other rhythm guitar tracks. So here's what this sounds like. So yeah, that's really just giving it a more mid-range forward sound, taking out some of those low mids again, and then boosting a little bit, not quite as much of the treble up as before. This is definitely a more mid-range oriented guitar tone that we used for this to really cut through in the choruses as you heard. So that's it. So now moving on to the lead guitar at the end of the choruses. This is a pretty similar situation to the rhythm guitar track with just one plugin, channel EQ, that's it. We got a pretty high low pass on this one because it's a much higher register that he's playing in, and as such, a lot of the mid-range is cut out, and quite a large boost at 5K there to make that cut through a little bit more. This is definitely supposed to sit quite far back in the mix as it does, so this is what this sounds like in and out with the EQ. So yeah, dead simple. All right, so processing on this was pretty simple, just a single parametric EQ with a pretty high low cut and then a similar sort of treble boost that we saw earlier on some of the other tracks. So let's hear it. So just a little bit more bite in that sort of 7 kilohertz range. All right, so for the lead guitar tracks during the bridge of the song, Kyle does a little bit of tremolo picking for that part. And in the original track, he either recorded his electric guitar straight DI, possibly, or added some distortion after the fact during mixing, as there's a lot more high frequency content than you might expect from a guitar amplifier there. So we wanted to emulate the same exact thing. So when tracking the guitars here, we bumped the preamp gain up a ton to get just a ton of clipping happening, and that's what you can see with this waveform here. And you'll notice in the video we have 3 different shots of it. We actually only ended up recording 2 tracks of audio. The fundamental note at halftime and then a third up, double time of that, basically. So what I've done here is I've actually duplicated the tracks and delayed one to create a stereo effect. But in terms of processing on the fundamental or center track, everything's pretty simple here. We just have a parametric EQ with a low cut and then a little bit of high frequency boost around 5 kilohertz. So let's hear what that sounds like. So yeah, that EQ is overall just, again, removing low end and giving a little bit of that lower treble boost to help these guitars cut through the mix a little bit better. Moving on to the guitar part that was recorded a third up. These guitar tracks, the processing on them is exactly the same. One of them just happens to have a sample delay of 1,039 samples, which gives it that sort of stereo effect as if there were 2 tracks going at the same time. In terms of processing on these, though, again, just like the center track, we have a low cut around 200 hertz and then that sort of 4 or 5K treble boost to help it cut through the mix. So let's hear what that does. So as you can see, overall, just like the other track, brightening it up, helping it cut through the mix a little bit. And with the delay on both tracks, here's what the 2 sound like together, panned. So overall, it does a pretty good job of giving the illusion of having a double-tracked, panned left and right guitar here, and given the scenario where we didn't have the other track, it works quite well. All right, so now let's talk about vocals a little bit. So in terms of recording, we were able to thankfully record in a very acoustically dead space. It was acoustically treated. This helped as the microphone, as I've said before, was omnidirectional. And in terms of microphone placement, we had the mic about 6 inches away from Kyle's mouth, but positioned off to the side of his mouth so that the airstream coming out of his mouth passes right by it. And since the microphone is so small, it just goes right by it and makes plosives or anything like that a complete non-issue. So to save time here, I'm just going to go over the processing on just the lead vocal track. The processing is exactly the same for all the other tracks, so there's no point in going through each of those. So let's take a look. All right, so up first here, we have GarageBand's Noise Gate plugin. This is an extremely simple plugin with just a threshold control, so let's hear what that does.
You are growing up and building up to something real. Like the winding gears that make a ticking clock. Feel exactly what you're meant to feel. That creeps up.
So not the greatest noise gate plugin out there. It kind of does the job. It's a little bit choppy. The release time is extremely fast, so... All right, so up next we have a parametric EQ. Here we see we're just doing a low cut at around 160 hertz or so. a mid-range cut at around 500 hertz, and then there seems to be a bit of a problem frequency at like 16K. And obviously not everyone can even hear that high, but I figured I might as well cut it out since it's there in the first place. So let's take a listen.
Up and building up to something real, like the winding gears that make a ticking clock. Feel exactly what you're meant to feel.
So yeah, that's what that sounds like, just cutting out some of those kind of low mid-range frequencies at around 500 hertz. Up next, we have Apple's Dynamics processor again. Here we have an attack time of only 5 milliseconds, a release time of 31 milliseconds, so it activates really fast. And then a pretty steep ratio, but because of the large knee on the compressor, it's pretty light, and the full effect of the ratio doesn't really come into effect at any point. So here's what this sounds like.
That creeps upon your empty future. They asked you once, they asked you twice, they asked you all your goddamn life. They said, who do you want to be when you grow?
So yeah, just doing a little bit of work to level out the audio. Pretty basic compression there. Up next, we have GarageBand's Space Designer Reverb plugin. I found this plugin actually to work quite well for reverb on vocals. As you can see, I have a decay time of about 2 seconds on the reverb, and then the output has been dropped down to minus 18 dB, and I think it sounds quite nice on vocals, actually. No EQ needed or anything like that, so let's hear it.
The hope that you see so far ahead, and open up the void that might come back to slip again.
So yeah, basic reverb, but sounds really nice. And then finally, we have another parametric EQ put in place. And you can see with this one, I've actually added 12 decibels of gain here. This is just to help out, give myself more headroom in the mix. So yeah, I'm going to pull that down, though, for the comparison. But here, we've just got some low mids cut at around 200 hertz. Some of those harsher vocal frequencies around 5 kilohertz, and then a ton of boost of 10K and above. As you could hear, the microphone isn't entirely that well detailed, and I just wanted to get as much detail out of it as I could. And I did bring up the noise floor in doing that, but it gets buried in the mix anyway, so it's not that big of a deal. So let's hear it. I've brought the gain down to an appropriate level where it's matched level-wise.
The hope that you see so far ahead, and open up the void that might come back to slip again. You can barely push away the tension.
So you can hear it's just overall smoothing the frequency response of the vocals out a little bit. And that's all I have on all the vocal tracks. All right, so in terms of mastering, everything is really simple here. Up first, I just have Apple's multi-band compressor, doing a little bit of control on the low frequency band and the high frequency band. And then also, this is kind of a side effect of this plugin actually, but it is reducing the mid-range frequency bands a little bit. So it's doing a little bit of EQ in that regard. Because without this plugin on, the mix is pretty mid-rangey as is. So let's hear it. All right, and then the only other plugin on the mastering chain is just GarageBand's limiter. We're just adding 3.5 decibels of gain here, and then it's doing limiting to bring the track up to about minus 10 LUFS integrated. So let's hear what that does.
They asked you once, they asked you twice, they asked you every single time. They said, who do you want to be when you
that's pretty much it for mastering. One other note that I'd like to talk about real fast is that I didn't actually use the earbuds themselves to mix on. I actually used these Tascam headphones. The earbuds were unfortunately a little bit too trashy to mix on. You could do it. They both had the same frequency response in both ears, so if you really knew them and you were able to use reference tracks and all that stuff, you could make it work. It would be a pain, but you could make it work. But since I knew these headphones, that's what I decided to use. These are only about $30 headphones anyways, so again, still very budget-oriented, but in this case, we only used the little microphone from the $5 set of earbuds. So yeah, what'd you guys think? I think this turned out way better than I was expecting, especially out of a little earbud microphone like that. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching, and big thanks to Kyle Germain as well for helping me out with this project. Really talented guy, really talented musician and artist. All his links to his stuff will be down in the description below. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Let me know what you thought of this little project I've done here. And yeah, I'll see you guys later.